Hello, it is Lisa again with the third and final lecture for the first week of Unit 3 for Women in World Politics. And I'm continuing with the story of women and war in Kashmir. So, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act of 1958 was originally put in place in India to deal with some of the internal conflict in the northeast of India. And it's still in effect up there and in several places and in a variety of parts of India. However, this AFSPA was applied to Jammu Kashmir in July of 1990, right? And so this is the time when violence is escalating, the Pandits are being driven out, etc. And basically what the Armed Forces Special Powers Act is military law, or a state of emergency, right? So it permits the security personnel to derogate civil liberties, or basically disrespect civil liberties in a way that you can't do in peacetime. So this little info graph here gives you some examples of what it is that security personnel can do. And it's supposed to apply only to soldiers, but in practice, they've applied it to police, paramilitaries, etc. And basically what happens under this decree, and Jammu Kashmir is still under it, is that there is near impunity for the security forces. So most importantly for our study here, the Act permits security personnel to search Kashmiris' bodies and buildings whenever they choose. They don't need a warrant, right? So with respect to women, you can see where this is going, right? It's, basically giving them carte blanche to perpetrate sexual violence if they want to. They also have immunity for prosecution under this act. So there was a change in the law in 2013 that made an exception for rape, right? And so rape is, of course, a crime that it's hard to come up with any reason why you did it in self-defense, right? So they said, well, okay, a soldier in an area that's governed by AFSPA can get a sentence for no less than 7 years of committing rape. But in practice, this really hasn't been implemented, and it exempts such penalties if the crime took place in the disturbed areas where this legislation took force. So basically, the security forces can pretty much do whatever they want to whomever they want to and get away with it. And they have. So when the unrest was bubbling up in the early 1990s, Kashmir originally fought it with their police, but the police, of course, primarily came from that region, and so the central government, or the federal government in India, was apprehensive about this. They were afraid that some of the Kashmiri police would have loyalties to the locals rather than to the Indian government, and they might have sympathy for some of the rebels. So instead, the Indian federal government brought into Kashmir the Central Reserve Police Force, 2 different branches of the border police, the Army, and also the federal security forces. By late 1992, pro-government death squads began operating, and in 1993, the Indian federal government created a special unit just for dealing with unrest in Kashmir. The acronym is RR, and according to one of its members, RR stands for raid and rape. Right, that's a bad joke. It doesn't actually stand for that. So, as your readings note, women have played a role as informants and to some degree defectors in this conflict, right? So, in the 1990s, as some of the people who had joined the various Kashmiri militant groups were captured or surrendered or whatnot, they, plus some informants, comprised other units, pro-government militias, whose participants did not wear uniforms and thus could not be held accountable for their actions. And you'll see in later chapters that this tactic was something that the federal government did in other disturbed areas in India as well. So, I mean, these are basically dirty war tactics, right? Because, in the unlikely event that somebody in these squads are captured, well, they're not government employees, right? So defectors from the Kashmiri separatist groups provided the person power, primarily manpower, for Indian police death squads, their special operations group, which started as only 10 men but then grew to thousands. The Indian government also formed village defense committees in Jammu Kashmir, particularly in those areas that were inhabited by the Sikh and Hindu minorities. So here you see a picture of Indian officers training women, and by their outfits, it looks like they're probably Hindu women, right? So these are basically, home defense, land defense committees, and they are near the border with Pakistan, near the line of control. So in many cases, these women's menfolk were working somewhere else, and they were continually getting bothered and worse by marauding militants, right? So some of them were rather eager to learn how to defend themselves. So you may recall that in August of last year, all heck broke loose in Jammu Kashmir when India's parliament stripped Kashmir of its special status. Now, the special status was Article 370, and this article had given Jammu Kashmir, even after it had been incorporated into India, some internal autonomy on property rights and citizenship laws. So Kashmir, all of a sudden, I think it was like the 4th or the 5th of August, there was an announcement that went out on international media that all tourists should leave Kashmir immediately because of a potential terrorist threat. And I remember thinking, that's weird. And then the next day, the government locked down Kashmir, and it's basically stayed in a lockdown since. Some ebbing and flowing, but mostly a lockdown. So what the Indian government said was that it was stripping it of its special status, and it was going to be administered straight from Delhi in order to promote the Kashmiri economy and to reduce corruption in Kashmir. The assumption of Kashmiris, however, is that India wants to change the demographics of the region by sending in Hindu settlers. And remember, Jammu Kashmir is the only state in India that had a Muslim majority. And here you can see a controversy that erupted when a Indian politician chief minister, outright said, basically, hey guys, now it's your opportunity to go get you a hot Kashmiri babe, right? Apparently, the stereotype is that Kashmiri women are particularly attractive. So, as part of this blackout in Kashmir in August, internet and phones were blocked. And for the most part, they've remained blocked. So when the lockdown first happened, they left only a few government phones open for emergencies, but you had to go through, if you were an ordinary citizen in Kashmir, you had to go through 16,000 layers of security in order to access these phones. So basically, people in Kashmir were not able to communicate with the outside world and still have a difficult time doing so. In early 2020, India's Supreme Court said that this lockdown on the media and on freedom of expression in Kashmir was unconstitutional. Because remember, India is a democracy. So the internet had been shut down for 7 months. Now it's technically open, but it's still quite restricted, and access is only on very slow 2G networks. They also are episodically clamping down on social media and on texting. So what the government says is that they don't want Kashmiris spreading misinformation that might cause hysteria or riots. Kashmiris obviously feel that they're being muzzled and that it's part of an attempt to, number one, prevent them from organizing, but number two, to hide the dirty deeds of the security forces. So as you can imagine, when all this went down in August, protests erupted and kept on going for a month within Kashmir. Then protests, in sort of solidarity protests, erupted over the border in Pakistani-administered Kashmir. And by the end of the month and then into September, protests spilled over to Pakistan itself, right, in solidarity with the people in occupied Jammu Kashmir. And Malala actually got involved in this, not by picking up weapons or anything, but Malala from Pakistan expressed publicly her concern for the civilians of Kashmir. In September, a 5-woman team of prominent activists, investigators, went into Kashmir and did an investigation, wrote a fact-finding report. They found that the schools and shops and transportation in Kashmir had been shut for weeks, that this was causing a humanitarian catastrophe, right, that people were not able to get to the doctor, et cetera, et cetera. They found that some 13,000 Kashmiri youth had been detained. Some of these were as young as 13 and 14 years old, and that torture in detention was commonplace. So these are Indian women, right? These are women in India reporting back to India about the conditions in Kashmir. October 31st, India went ahead with the split of Jammu and Kashmir that I mentioned in the previous lecture, and so they turned it into 2 separate states. Remember that Ladakh is scarcely populated, right? And so again, I think the suspicion is that India is going to try to shuttle a lot of people, especially Hindus, up to Ladakh. So in terms of women's roles in this conflict, you can definitely apply Goldstein's refrain that the roles that women play typically in war are mothers, here's a woman tending her son's grave, sweethearts, and nurses. And also overground workers, which is also discussed in the She Goes to War reading. OGW is the acronym that the police and security forces in India use. OGW is an overground worker, and according to the police, they are militants without weapons. Right? So they are often women, not always women, but they are involved in logistics, spying, a lot of shuttling, right? You know, shuttling weapons to and fro, shuttling money here and there, etc. And I think that their loose burqas or headscarves, etc., make this smuggling particularly easy. So according to your reading, most of the time these women are not formally involved with any militant group. Their connection is usually to a man who is involved, right? Either sister, daughter, whatever, boyfriend. So there have been a few episodes of violence perpetrated by women in Kashmir. Your readings mentioned some of them. I've called them mildly militant women because you'll see when we get to the other parts of India that women have played a much more direct role in the wars. This sex for terrorism headline is a little misleading. I don't think she was really hoeing for the cause. Basically I think she was seducing them, sweet-talking them, and then, once she got their attention, then she was trying to get them to join the various terrorist groups. So we know that militants have trained some women in the use of arms, right? And the readings talk about one episode from a few decades ago. But there's no evidence that women have actually served as combatants in the ranks of the Kashmiri insurgents. And your authors also note that, or the author of the reading also notes that there's no evidence that any of these groups even have any women cadres. So they have used women as proverbial honeypots, right, to lure men, Indian men of the security forces or police or whatnot into an area where the militants can then kill the Indian man, right? But in terms of the women themselves, they've also had women be suicide bombers, right? And so there have been a few episodes of bombings that have involved women. But for the most part, you're not finding women as the direct perpetrators of violence in Kashmir. The exception, of course, is rioting in the streets, in which young Kashmiri women have participated quite a bit. And most often they're pictured throwing stones, as in here, but in some cases they throw chili pepper or chili powder in the eyes of the police officers. When I read this book that I'd assigned the second time after I'd done some research of my own on Kashmir, I was pretty sure I knew who the fictitious Farida was. Right now, remember, according to the author, she's changed the names, but the stories are true. And I'm pretty sure that it's Asiya Andrabi, I guess is how you say her name. And so she is a very prominent women's rights activist with some direct links to terrorist groups through a male relative. I believe it's her brother. And recently she's been in the news for charges of diverting money that was supposed to go to Kashmiris to the education of people in her family. But I don't know whether there's any truth to that. But she would be an example of a very high-profile, well-connected, powerful Kashmiri woman who, very strongly thinks that women should be able to defend themselves to protect their honor, right? But she doesn't think that women should be involved in combat. So a question that I have is whether Kashmiri women's lack of direct involvement in the armed conflict is ideological, whether it's based on their particular interpretation of Islam and thinking that, that's not women's role, or whether it's pragmatic, right? And if you haven't read this chapter yet, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but you'll find that the women who got involved with the militant groups, particularly the one in Pakistan, they got snookered pretty badly, right? So some of them got treated quite badly, not only by the Indian security forces, but also by the rebels. So in terms of peacemaking in Kashmir, women have been largely absent. This isn't supposed to be the case. UN Security Council Resolution 1325 emphasizes that women are supposed to be present at the peace table, but because women are not the ones doing the fighting, I think most people in the region think it's just natural and normal that women are not involved in the peacemaking. So this conflict has been going on for a very long time, as you know, and here are some estimates of the death tolls, although we don't know, right? And all sides involved probably have a motive to either inflate or minimize the totals. But you can see that a surprisingly large number of those who've been killed were female. So in terms of sexual violence, there's been a lot. That's what I've been researching in terms of Kashmir. And interestingly, a lot of it, more so than any other region of India, a lot of it is actually directed against boys, or I guess I should say teenagers. I think some of it is because in this society, it's not really all that common for women to be out and about that much. So I think that you have more sexual access to boys than you would girls. And then I think some of it has to do with the proximity to Afghanistan and the culture of, bacha batsi there, which is boy play, right? So among certain groups in Pakistan and Afghanistan, it's considered acceptable for men, usually married older men, to have teenage boys that they play with sexually, right? And that's just sort of seen as the way it is, right? So in any case, there's sexual abuse of boys and some of men. In terms of sexual abuse of women, it's really hard to count. Obviously, this is a culture in which being raped is going to be very stigmatized, so people are not going to want to advertise the fact. Also, the words that they use are very euphemistic. So when I look at reports, they often talk about, security forces molested 12 girls. And I don't know whether molested means squeezed their butt or raped them, But in any case, the Kashmir Media Service writes that from At the beginning of 1989 until mid-2019, there were 11,126 cases of women being gang raped or molested in Kashmir. Of these, 933 had transpired since mid-2016. And some of this will take place in detention, but for the most part, these are happening during those raids, right? Because the military law gives the armed forces, basically the power to come into your house in the middle of the night to look for weapons or whatnot, and then they terrorize the women in the houses. So it's been pretty hard to find out what's the latest in Kashmir because they're still on lockdown. And now, of course, their military lockdown has morphed into a medical lockdown, what with the COVID-19 epidemic. It looks like they have maybe about 100 cases or so the last time I looked, which probably means they have a whole lot more. Okay, so in terms of your discussion assignment for the discussion board, here's your question. Should the women in Kashmir who want to resist Indian occupation attempt to integrate into the exclusively male insurgent groups? Should they form their own militant groups? So I will go ahead and post this and looking forward to hearing from you. Let me know if you have any questions.